Um, we are pretty small, so if people want to introduce themselves, unmute themselves, tell us, your name, your pronouns, maybe what organization or garden you're with, and then how many years you've been gardening. If you don't feel comfortable unmuting and sharing, feel free to do it in the chat so we get a sense of who's here, and any questions that you might have. Anyone want to unmute themselves and introduce who they are? No
I'll,
pressure.
I'll introduce myself.
Great.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jennifer Hill. I'm a newcomer to Chicago. I'm from Colorado, and I'm really excited to be in Chicago, living with my daughter and my grandson, because gardening here is super easy compared to Colorado. You put it in the ground and it grows after it's done being horribly cold here. Yeah. So I have been gardening probably since I was 15 years old, and I'm way past that now. And I love it. It's my muse, it's my joy, it's my passion. And however I can get my hands in the dirt, I like to do it. And that's it.
Great. I love that you said that because I lived in Colorado for a few years and people often ask me what the difference is. And I say in
Hmm.
Colorado, because the weather is so much more temperamental even than Chicago, you have to wait. It's actually a short
Yeah.
growing season. So
Yeah. And it's dry. It's just so different.
it's very
Yeah.
dry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to share, unmute and share?
I can share. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Danielle Russell, she, her pronouns. I needed to check myself just then because I always complain about how short our growing season is, but you're right. Like we can grow once it's, done freezing. So thank you for that
Mhm.
perspective. I've been gardening since I don't even know, but I know I really started getting into it maybe around 2011. So I don't even know what year it is now. Okay, so it's 2025. So like 14 years.
Awesome. Would anyone else like to share? You can also do it in the chat.
I can go. Hi, I'm Nona. I haven't
Mhm.
been on one of these calls before, but I've interacted, I think, with the group a little bit at some point. Um, I'm on the west side in Chicago. I've been in Chicago for like 5 years. I used to work in like local food, and I've worked for a lot of like urban farms and some real farms. I grew food. I lived in England for a while, if you want to talk about climates. It's maybe a longer growing season, but it never gets warm. You like cannot grow a tomato outside.
Mhm.
So anyway, this kind of work was sort of my job for a long time, but it's not anymore. And so I'm just kind of trying to figure out how I plug in. I also have more of my own space than I've ever had before. So just kind of figuring out how I fit into this kind of stuff these days. And nice to meet y'all.
Thanks for
Same.
listening. Would anyone else like to share? Feel free to put it in the chat. Awesome. Okay, so today's focus is composting, and I am very, very happy to be introducing Alice. Alice grew up in Chicago and became interested in growing and preserving food as a high school student. She has worked on small scale farms in Maine and Vermont and is currently the farm manager at the Urban Canopy. She has managed compost systems on farms, in classrooms, and backyards, and is always excited about ways to reduce food waste. She is also on the advisory board of Chicago Grows Food. If you are interested in learning more about that, let me know. She's been a wonderful asset and team player, and I'm really excited to have her presenting on compost today. Take it away, Alice.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm super excited to talk to you all. So I prepared a slideshow with a whole bunch of information about different compost system options and like making it work for the space that you have. But I'm curious before we start kind of where everybody is coming from. So I'd be curious to know either if you want to like unmute and say something or put in the chat what your composting experience is, and if you are not currently composting but want to, what maybe barriers you've encountered along.
Did I freeze or did Alice freeze?
Somebody froze.
I think she froze.
Okay. Well, while she's getting her internet back, if you all want to share outwardly, I can take notes on the barriers that you're having or your experience composting. Feel free to also put it in the chat and then she can take a look at it when she's back on. Yeah, I saw a couple people unmute if you want to share your composting experience.
I have actually never kept a composting situation before. I've collected compost that actually Urban Canopy would pick up. And I feel like I know like a lot about compost, but I have never actually done it before.
Hi, Alice. I had people just start sharing. I think I gathered that you wanted them to share their experience composting and any barriers. And so Danielle just shared that they have a lot of knowledge, but they haven't composted before. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I've like right now I have the world's like most passive compost. It's seriously just a pile. And I've often gone to using like commercial compost companies because like I think it's great, but in it can just be a lot to manage when you're trying to do everything else. That's like my biggest barrier to it. Uh it's another thing to manage. And then like if you're doing it at home, a lot of the times you're just like not hitting the temperatures and stuff to like really get good quality compost in the end.
Thanks for that.
For me, my name is Crystal. I grow at home in my personal garden, but I also have a community garden space. I have not introduced compost into community garden space yet. I have tumblers, but I haven't started over there and hope to start this year. And my personal garden experience, this isn't the most technical way to say it, but I tried and I always get really grossed out. And I I mean, I obviously know the benefit of composting, right? And so I think for me it's the missing link to kind of like the cycle that I'm trying to create in my growing space. And specific barriers I run into when I've tried the tumbler before is trying to figure out like the correct ratio of like the other items you're supposed to add, I guess, like maybe I guess wood chips or things like that. So that's one thing. I will say last year we kind of lazy composted. So like we had a pile of dirt that was left over from the previous season and we just like saved our scraps and like dumped in the dirt. And then like the next season we just tossed the whole thing in the bed. So like we didn't probably fully do it, but we did that. We put that in a flower bed, not a vegetable bed. But yeah, so my barrier is the knowledge as far as keeping up with all the layers of different things you're supposed to do. And yeah, minimizing my growth factor.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Does anyone else have experience or barriers that they want to share?
I'll share. I have composted for many years, basically turned it over to my husband. But that's in Colorado. Here in Chicago, I've got the little compost bin next to the sink. But we have chickens and we have worms and we have a tumbler composter. And I feel like I don't have enough of something for the composter after I've given stuff to the chickens and the worms. And so it never gets hot. It never really makes into a nice compost. So my barrier is I don't have enough stuff to put into my compost pile. I guess that's what it boils down to. I mean, I guess I would rather have the eggs than the compost, but it would be great to have some of that compost to put around my flower beds and my vegetable garden.
If anyone else wants to share in the chat or on coming off mute, happy to hear experiences at any point along the way. Can you all see my screen that I just shared?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So what I have prepared today is just kind of an overview, like a high level overview of like what composting is and why it matters, and then going into some of the specific strategies, sort of tailored to composting in an urban environment. And we can talk troubleshooting for each of these for anyone who's like used them but had challenges, and also talk about some of the pros and cons if you're thinking about implementing any of these at home or in like a community garden space. So I think most of us probably know this, but I always like to say it because there is a common misconception that anything that is biodegradable is going to compost, whether you put it in a landfill or in a compost pile. Um, and that's just not true. Composting food properly is super important, for a few reasons. So a huge amount of the material that ends up in our landfills, 51% according to the EPA, is food and garden waste that could be composted, but that's going into landfills where it's decomposing anaerobically, so without air. Um, and that releases methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Methane is also super flammable, that's one of the reasons if you've ever seen those like crazy videos of landfill fires, methane in combination with combustible materials that are dumped in landfills can create these landfill fires, which then dump like super toxic fumes into the air, which impact the people who live near landfills. So that's not great. Keeping food out of landfills is important. And if you compost food properly, if you compost food aerobically and give it access to air, you're working in conjunction with bacteria, with fungi, with invertebrates that actually do the breaking down of the food for you. And it leaves you with really nice material for your garden, which is a bonus. So composting is great. There is there are anaerobic compost facilities that will like capture methane and use that for fuel. But when it's happening in a landfill, that methane is just being released into the atmosphere. So overall, a good thing to keep food scraps out of landfills, and composting is a really good way to do that. Um, the way composting works is that those fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates that I just mentioned break down organic materials. Um, and those are living things that need carbon, they need nitrogen, they need air, and they need water. So when I've managed compost systems in the past, specifically like big piles, I almost think of it like I'm farming those microorganisms or those small organisms, right? Like I'm adding stuff to the compost pile when I'm feeding them. I'm turning it and I'm making sure that they get access to the air that they need. And then I'm also monitoring moisture levels to make sure that they have enough water. So when you're managing a compost pile, it varies a little bit depending on whether you're using a tumbler or a pile or some of these different systems that we can talk about in a little bit. The ratio of carbon to nitrogen is really important. So that will impact how things break down and your compost pile temperature. And you'll read that the ideal ratio is 30 to 1, which is great, but like it's really hard to use that information to actually manage your compost pile, right? Because then you have to know how much carbon is in wood chips versus how much nitrogen is in the like wilted lettuce that you're composting. So I like to think about just looking at the compost pile and seeing what it needs because it will typically tell you. So if your pile or your tumbler is too dry or too cool, that's usually a sign that you need more nitrogen. So things like kitchen scraps, fresh cut grass, fresh leaves, coffee grounds, those are all good sources of nitrogen. And they also tend to add moisture as well. So if you're using a lot of kitchen scraps, if you're using a lot of like wet leaves from your garden, you typically don't need to add additional water to your compost. But on the flip side, if your compost pile is super smelly, if it's really hot, if you're taking the temperature and it's like over 140 degrees, if it's really wet, you probably need more carbon. So Things like dry leaves, it's great to save those and add those to your compost throughout the year. You can do any non-glossy, so like not magazine paper, but regular newspaper or cardboard that you shred up. Small twigs, depending on the size of your compost system, can sometimes be broken down, and then straw. Those are all great sources of carbon. Um, I mentioned temperature monitoring, and if you're doing a pile especially, it's great to keep an eye on the temperature because that gives you a lot of information about what's happening like deep inside your compost pile. So you can get really long thermometers that can probe like into the middle of the compost pile, and you can see, okay, this is a compost pile that is kind of right at that 90 to 140 degree temperature, or it's way too hot, or it hasn't reached temperature, and make adjustments based on that. The reason that you want it to get into that range is because that's the ideal sort of like temperature range for all of the organisms that are living in your compost. But also, if you're worried about weed seed, like if you're putting weeds in your compost pile, you want to reach the kind of top end of that range to kill off weed seed so that when you spread your compost, you're not just filling your garden bed with weed seed. It's also important if you're worried about any pathogens, if you're potentially, it's best practice not to compost, garden waste that might have any like fungal or bacterial issues. But if that does end up in your compost pile, getting it to that higher temperature will help kill those things off so that you're not spreading them throughout your garden when you spread compost.
So, Alice, can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so then you suggest having a compost thermometer?
Yeah, you can get super cheap like analog thermometers that are just they have a super long probe. I've seen them at like Home Depot or garden
Mhm.
stores, and they're great.
All right. And then you were talking about the stuff that we can put into the compost pile. What about chicken manure? Can you put straw with chicken manure in it into a composter? Is that something then that makes it too hot, or for the like how long would it have to stay in a composter?
Yeah, you can absolutely compost chicken manure. That's a really great source of nitrogen. Um, and like you said, you would add the straw to kind of like balance out the carbon nitrogen ratio. If you are composting manure, it's and you're going to be using that compost on garden beds where you might be growing food. Having it reach that high temperature, that like 140 degrees, is extra important just to kill off any potential pathogens, any bacteria, anything that could make you sick. If you're eating any vegetables raw that are coming out of that garden. Um, and you can compost other types of manure too. Like I have known people in Chicago who go to stables on the outskirts of the city and pick up horse manure to add to their compost because that's also really, really good nitrogen. And the stables will give it away for free. You should never compost any cat or dog waste or pig. If you have pigs in the city, I'd be very impressed. But those three types of manure you should absolutely never compost just because of some of the pathogens that can live in cat, dog, and pig manure. Um, Anyone else have any questions or comments before we kind of dive into some of the specific systems?
I kind of do. This is Carmen, and I'm concerned about households that you purchase that are just farm soil, mold, and a few other things. They will sell you composted soil. What are some of the components that we should look at that's going to be involved in those soils?
I was having a little bit of a hard time hearing that. Was anyone else, or is that on my end?
It was garbled at first and then got clearer towards the end of what you were saying.
I'm talking about compost. Purchasing compost maybe from the municipal or either from a garden center.
I think I understand. Carmen, are you asking like when you're purchasing compost, what sort of ingredients should you be prioritizing and looking for when you like buy it in a bag?
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you. Um, so yeah, if you're purchasing compost from like a big garden store or um like Home Depot, or I saw the grocery store has it right now. Um, Typically those are coming from like big industrial scale composters, and they have all sorts of certifications that tell you that that compost is free of heavy metals and pathogens. It's typically going to be like nicely sifted, so there won't be any, you won't find like bones or anything in that compost. If you're getting your compost from a smaller source, like if you're going straight to a garden that composts or some other organization that has a composting system and they distribute their compost, I would just ask about their practices. I think any place that's distributing their compost should be able to tell you like what they're doing to mitigate any potential like spread of pathogens. But there are certifications. So like the company that I work for, we compost on a like large industrial scale, and we have certifications that say our compost is tested weekly for a whole series of things. And then if we sell or donate our compost to like a school, for example, they'll ask us for that certification. So there are systems in place for some of those larger compost distributors.
Yeah, I would also like to add, just like your food, you need to know how your compost is made. Now, my folks out in California back in the days, there were folks only who put natural stuff in your compost. No bat guano, like lot of Rastaman, they will not put any, like if the chicken shit, the duck, the other stuff, they will not add that to the compost because they want to keep that compost pure. You have people who put fish bone in the compost, other people will not do that. So that's kind of just the only thing that I will point out. But there are folks that will put the chicken poop, whatever, in the hole itself and mix it with other organic matter within that space. So that's just the one thing I just drop into that mix there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Know where your compost is coming from. So, we've already talked about a few of these different systems. It sounds like some of you already have some of these in place or have used them in the past, but I broke at-home composting systems into four sort of general categories. And then within these, there are subcategories. There are different strategies. Some of it's going to depend on your space and like exactly what you're composting. But those four categories are compost piles, tumblers, vermicompost, and pick up and drop off. So compost piles are awesome because you can compost really large volumes of food scraps and garden waste. You don't need a ton of equipment to get started necessarily. Um, and they tend to be the easiest to keep at temperature just because of the volume that you can have in a compost pile. Um, However, they take up a lot of space. So if space is limited, that can be a barrier. You do have to turn the pile, and if you don't have access to like a tractor or a skid steer, you're probably turning it by hand, which is a lot of work. And in the city, it can be difficult to exclude pests. So if you're worried about that in your backyard or your community garden, um, there are strategies you can use, but it is sitting on the ground. So sometimes that can attract certain pests. But compost piles are exactly what they sound like. They're big piles of compost. They often sit on the ground or on a tarp, and you just add your material as it builds up. When you're getting started, it's nice to do a little bit of like a layering of materials. So people will often do a layer of leaves and then a layer of grass clippings and maybe another layer of leaves. And that just helps trap air inside your pile so that um, when you're not turning it, those microorganisms still have like pockets of air within your pile. And then when you're ready to dump food scraps, you can like dig a little hole in it, dump your food scraps, cover them up so they're not exposed. You're not attracting, um, hungry critters to your compost pile. And then every month or so, depending on the scale of your pile and kind of how compacted it gets, it's good to like completely flip it over. So typically that means with a pitchfork and shovels, like taking your pile and completely turning it, which just helps make sure that that decomposition process stays aerobic and not anaerobic. Um, a 3-bin system is super popular. That's what I have in the middle photo because you can have an active pile that you're continually adding food and garden scraps to, and then you turn that into the middle bay where stuff is like breaking down. You're not adding anything new, but it's actively composting. And then you flip that into the 3rd bay when it's time to just let that compost cure. Make sure that everything is fully broken down before you add that into your garden beds. But that takes up a lot of space and it can require a little bit of building in order to make something that's going to work for you. Compost tumblers are awesome in the city because they are contained, they keep pests away, they prevent smell. And I think if that ick factor is an issue for you, it's kind of out of sight. You don't have to look at it. In my experience, they really don't smell if you're keeping your ratios kind of where they should be. Um, They are expensive if you buy one ready made. So that one in the middle photo is just like I looked up compost tumbler and it's one that you can buy for like $200. And they are limited. You are limited in term by the size of your tumbler, right? So you can't add more material to your tumbler than your tumbler can accommodate. But typically, if you're mostly going to be composting food scraps, this is going to be sufficient. Or it sounds like if you're giving your food scraps to your chickens, it might even be too big. But these are really great for like getting started with composting, or if you have a backyard but you don't want to commit to like a full pile, these are awesome. And there are so many really cool tutorials for how to make your own tumbler with like cheap or free materials instead of buying one. So those are the two photos on the left and the right. And there is a little bit of a learning curve just in terms of figuring out like what that ratio needs to be in order to keep it warm. These are harder to get to heat up than the piles just because the volume is a little bit smaller. But I helped my parents set one of these up in their backyard. That's what they use now, and they're able to keep it warm all throughout the winter just by adding stuff to it regularly. And we can talk about troubleshooting for these specifically at the end as well. And I saw a note in the chat about applying compost, and I have a slide for that, so we will get to that. Vermicompost or worm bins are a little bit different than other types of compost systems because you're not actually collecting the broken down food as much as you're collecting worm poop or worm castings. But vermicompost is cool because you can do it inside your house. So you can have like a little bin or tote that you keep under the sink and you can put the worms in there and you add food scraps and you can watch them break down. I've used these in classrooms before, which is super cool because it's almost like a pet, but then students can add like apple cores or peels or things from their lunch, and we can kind of watch them turn into something that can be added to our garden to help enrich the soil. They don't work well for large amounts of food scraps. So like I wouldn't add garden waste to a worm bin. And some things just don't break down very well. So if you're adding like a lot of citrus peels, those tend to just sit. The worms don't particularly like them. And then because there are worms living in the worm bin and the worm bins tend to not heat up in the same way that compost piles do, you have to keep your worms warm, which means you can't have a worm bin outside year round in Chicago. And then the last option, which is kind of a nice entry and is actually what I do at home because I live in an apartment, is compost pickup or drop off. So you don't need any outdoor space. There's no maintenance. You don't really have to handle your compost except for putting it in a bucket. And there are more and more options for how to have your compost picked up or dropped off. So On the left-hand side of the screen, I have a map with all of the city of Chicago compost drop-off locations. There are currently 20, and hopefully they will be adding more, but these are free compost drop-off sites where you can just bring your countertop bucket or your 5-gallon bucket or whatever you have, and you can drop off your scraps completely for free. They say the hours are limited to 7 to 7, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But I haven't confirmed that they're actually locking the bins overnight. And the nice thing about these pickup and drop off sites is that you can compost more things through these. So, like in your backyard compost pile, you probably shouldn't be composting like compostable cutlery because it will just take too long to break down, even though it technically is compostable. But in these large industrial compost systems, they can handle compostable cutlery, they can handle chicken bones, like really anything that is organic material will break down. There are other places where you can drop off compost too. I have a slide at the end with links and resources, but like I know Plant Chicago has a compost drop off that I believe is free. Global Gardens in Albany Park has a drop off that costs a little bit of money. And then if you don't want to drop your compost off, if you don't have a car or you don't have easy access to any of these locations, you can do compost pickup. So the company that I work for, Urban Canopy, has a residential compost pickup program where you just get a 5-gallon bucket and you can get it picked up as often as you'd like, from once a week to once a month. And all you do is you put it outside your door. I'm noticing all my typos, sorry, and I'm distracted. Uh, you don't need to do anything except put your bucket outside your door and they swap it out with a clean bucket every week. So that's very easy. The con is that you're giving your compost away. So you don't end up with all the finished compost that you would get if you were doing it on your own. At the Urban Canopy, I believe it's like every 10 buckets of compost that get picked up, you get 1 bucket of finished compost back. So you do get some of it, but you don't end up with all of the material. And then the pickup services are often, they're not free, but there are some free drop-off services, which is great. So once you have done all the work and you end up with finished compost, what do you do with it? So the first thing that you want to do, especially if you are putting it in garden beds that are going to be used for food, is you want to make sure that it's fully broken down. And you can do this in a couple of ways. You can visually see that there aren't chunks of food or leaves or anything else in your compost pile. You can monitor the temperature. And if your compost pile has been maintaining a nice high temperature and then starts to decrease in temperature, that's a sign that the breaking down process is kind of slowing down. Your organisms are not as active anymore because there's not as much food for them. And then your finished compost shouldn't smell. That's a good sign that once it no longer smells like compost, it's getting close to being ready. You can sift your compost if you are composting like lots of wood chips or tree twigs and sticks and things like that. But if you're mostly composting things like food scraps, you shouldn't have to. It should have a nice consistency even without sifting. But you can buy like large sifters if that's something you want to do. It's also a good way to sift out like any plastic or trash that might end up in your compost pile if that's something that you're worried about. And then you can do a lot with it. You can add your compost to garden beds at the beginning of the growing season. So the photo on the screen this is from the farm where I work. And these are our beds just a couple of weeks ago when we added a fresh layer of compost to all of them. You can also, throughout the growing season, use compost to side dress. So you can put compost alongside plants like continuous season crops if they need a little nutrient boost. Add them next to them and work it into the soil. And you can use it to mulch perennials. You can put it around trees, bushes. That will help both increase nutrition, but it also helps retain moisture. So doing it ahead of like a typically dry season can help your soil retain moisture if your plants aren't getting as much water. And then you can also make your own potting mix. So it's not recommended to grow in 100% compost, but you can mix your compost with coconut coir or peat moss and vermiculite. And that's a good potting mix for your indoor plants or like outdoor planters. So you can really use it all season long. But it is kind of nice to start the season with a nice base of compost so that you know all your plants are getting lots of nutrients. So that's the end of what I had kind of prepared, but I'm curious if there are other questions or like troubleshooting um, that anybody wants to work through together.
Alice, I have a question. This is Jennifer. Um, I have a little composter next to my sink, and I have been using those green compostable bags. I'm just curious because what I've noticed, I have to refer back to the fact that I'm from Colorado. It's dry there. I noticed that those bags don't really, they kind of break down, like you could never use them again, but I still see them in the compost pile. I was just curious, what are your thoughts about using those? It just makes it easier. It's not as messy when you're, cleaning out the compost bin next to the sink. Do you have any feelings about that?
Yeah, the bags are nice for mess. I have also noticed that they don't always fully break down, especially in like a backyard system. Um, One thing that I've done is I have lined my own like countertop compost bin
Mhm.
with paper bags, um,
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
which do tend to break down better, but if they get wet, they just completely
They just,
disintegrate.
right, right. Okay. But there's like there's no real downside to using those green compostable trash bags or uh compost bags. Do they really break down eventually, or do you know?
Yeah, so there are compostable materials that are like 100% compostable and they will eventually break down. It might take a little bit of time. It might take more time than your food scraps. There are, especially if you buy them on like places like Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
or if they're super cheap. I
Mm-hmm.
have seen bags that are labeled as compostable that I believe are actually plastic or contain some plastic.
Mm,
So be careful when you're buying those bags. Like, make sure you're getting them from a source you trust, or try to confirm what they're actually made of.
okay.
Um, I've seen that with cutlery as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And I had one more question. These places in Chicago where you can bring compost, um, if you're not going to bring compost because you're doing backyard composting, are they places that you can actually pick up compost? Can you take compost if you're not bringing, can you, if you're not bringing scraps and waste, can you actually go to these places and get compost?
So the city drop-off locations, they're not doing the composting on site. It's all going off site to like a big
Okay.
industrial scale composter. And
Okay.
that's a good question. I actually don't know what they are doing with the compost. If anybody else does, um, I haven't interacted with that system myself, and I'd be curious if anybody else has.
I don't, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think they are yet offering compost back to the community. I think the organizations that are doing that are more like the urban canopies.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't be surprised if over the next few years they start to implement that once they see they have enough maybe to give back. But I would guess that a lot of what they're composting will just go back into the city, like public spaces.
Okay.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, I want to know Which one has more nutrient value? Leaf compost with nothing else but grass clippings and leaves from a variety of different trees versus food scraps. Which one of those would have the most nutritional value? I'm pretty much raw and I don't particularly care for food scraps in my compost bins. And I also work in the forest reserve and I maintain the compost that's there where there's no food scrap. So I'm always concerned about the nutritional value of what the final product is. Can you share any light on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it shouldn't matter if you're using food scraps or not. Um, there are reasons why food scraps make for really good compost. Part of that is the moisture, right? If you think about like adding potato peels or apple cores or things like that to your compost, you're also adding moisture. But in terms of like the nutrients that you're going to get from the compost in your garden, the main one is going to be nitrogen. And that's going to come from compost, whether it is made up of food scraps or leaves or grass clippings. Um, so it shouldn't make a big difference.
Yeah, thank you. Because I'm always having to make sure it doesn't dry out. So I'm adding more moisture to it. So, but that's
Hmm.
water I could save to do something else.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing is the moisture, and it sounds like you're already doing that. So,
A question came in through the chat. I don't know if you saw it. What is the best way to store finished compost?
oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. It depends a lot on the scale of or like how much finished compost you're dealing with. Um, on the farm where I work, we get uh compost by the truckload and I just put a tarp over it and weigh it down so that we're not like losing compost every time it rains. And that works well. That also helps prevent like weed seed from getting into the compost, especially during like cottonwood season or when there's lots of weed seed flying around in the air. That keeps it out of our compost. And then it also doesn't get too wet, so it's just ready to go whenever we need it. If you have smaller amounts, 5 gallon buckets are great for storing it. That helps keep it from drying out too much. But also similarly kind of helps if you're storing it outside, helps keep weed seed from getting in it. But I'd say anything that is going to um, prevent it from getting waterlogged and keep weed seed out is going to be totally fine. And finished compost does get less and less nutrient dense the longer you let it sit. So it's not going to be harmful to use really old compost, but if you let compost sit for a couple years and then spread it, it's not going to be like as nutritionally dense as if you spread it when it was brand new. It's also probably just going to be drier and harder to work with.
Other composting questions, other general gardening questions while you're thinking about them.
One
Thank you.
more,
Oh,
one
yeah, go
more.
ahead.
um, there are a lot of organizations now that are giving away just bare root starters for trees. I mean, some really nice trees, native ones. How soon should you compost those? Um, should I put it in the hole while I'm adding the bare root, or maybe I need to wait a few weeks or so before I add it, or do I need to do it at all?
That's a great question. So I would say it depends on where you're growing, where the tree is going. If that's soil that you have been like amending over the years, if it's soil that you've kind of been managing, you probably don't need to add compost. But if it's soil that you're not sure about, or maybe soil that's been like a little bit neglected, you could add compost right in the hole where you plant the tree. And then you can also add compost around the edge of it as mulch, which will, like I said, kind of help retain moisture. Um, the thing to be careful about, whether you're adding like compost or wood chip mulch, is don't let it like hill up around the base of the tree. So you can do like a donut kind of around, but don't let the compost touch the base of the tree.
Great. Thank
Very important.
We had another
Yeah.
question coming through the chat too. Is it necessary to wet soil after adding compost if you're not ready to plant immediately?
Nope, it's not. Um, yeah, you can just add the compost and then let it sit until you're ready to plant.
Is it better to do that, like add the compost now and then plant in a couple of weeks, or is it best to add the compost and plant immediately, or it doesn't matter?
If your compost is truly finished, it shouldn't matter. If you're worried about weed seed in your compost, you can spread it, give it a couple of weeks, see what germinates, and then uh like cultivate it and then seed in. That can be one thing to do, but weed seed is really the only reason I would spread compost early. But sometimes it's just when you have the time. So yeah. Anyone else have other composting, maybe like composting facts to share? Anything we didn't talk about? I know there's a lot of knowledge and experience in this room, so would love to hear anything else that folks have found works for them.
I have a question. It's about the vermiculture compost. Is it, we tend to just use the liquid that comes off of it and then we dilute it down. Is it is it better to, is that just as effective as using the worm castings, or would it be better to use the worm castings to give the soil a little bit more volume?
Yeah, so the liquid that you're collecting is more like a compost tea, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not stuff that has come out of the worm's digestive system. Sorry for being a little gross, but like the castings are the digested food.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the liquid is not. So they're different. I have not used compost tea a lot in my farm systems, partially just because it's hard to manage on a large scale. I find it to be a little bit cumbersome and also kind of gross. But there's no harm in spreading that, but it is going to be different than the castings.
Do
Yeah,
you,
the compost tea could be a little stinky.
yeah, yeah,
And we could also, why we talk about it is just kind of, your compost tea do talk to you too. And it's the balance of wet and dry, because sometimes you got to have a little bit more dry grass. And you got to also make sure that airflow through that stuff is definitely crucial. And that monitor is, I know that's an additional expense, but that's also a good, you know, probably a good investment to let you know what's going on, that you have enough heat, especially if you're not in a part of the yard that have got that full sun.
mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't use, I'm like the plastic, I rather the brown bag. I don't even want to go down any kind of plastic road, even though it's supposedly
Mm-hmm.
biodegradable. Do I trust it?
Mm-hmm.
Not really.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
I see the question about does compost tea work? Um, I'm guessing by work, do you mean is it adding nutrients to the soil? Um, and the answer is yes, like you are putting nutrition into the soil. I think the reason that I prefer solid compost is that not only does it provide nutrition to your plants, but you also get that added benefit of like improving soil structure, which helps retain moisture, which helps, stave off weeds. So you kind of get that dual mulching plus the nutrition benefit, but compost tea is a way to add nutrition to your soil, absolutely.
Plus the compost, that dry compost put back a little skin on the earth too. It helps with the soil since we have lost so much relative to the
Hmm.
soil, the quality of soil.
Yeah.
In your
Yeah.
respective garden or your grow bag.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd never thought of it like skin, but I kind of like that.
Yeah, I do too.
Other questions, please keep them coming if you have them. I did put a survey link in the chat. If you can take a couple minutes to fill it out, it really just helps us better understand what you all want to learn and how we can provide that content. Composting came from surveys of people interested in learning about this, so we really want to make sure that these are relevant and helpful for all of you. So if you can take a few minutes to fill that out, it would be amazing. Other questions? Things you want to know about your garden? Curiosity about
Um,
Chicago grows food? Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Melody.
yeah, I do have a question about just purchasing compost that's already pre-made. I've noticed when I've looked like Home Depot or Lowe's, there's different kinds. So there's like the vermiculture created compost, and then there's like cow manure compost is what some of them are labeled as. And I was curious if preparing beds for like a flower garden or like planting hydrangea and things like that, or really just whenever you're deciding what kind of compost to use when buying specifically for what you're planting, how to approach making that decision, or is it just all the same and it's all just compost and it's good? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's all compost, so to some extent it's all going to be like useful and helpful in your garden. In terms of flowers and like specifically hydrangeas, that's not something that I have a ton of experience with, so I'm not actually sure like exactly what the nutrient profile you would be aiming for with your soil is. But I know some of the manure-based composts are really high in nitrogen, and you tend to get more of like an immediate nitrogen boost. Whereas with like a more typical compost, it's a slower nitrogen release. So if you're looking for like a big nitrogen boost partway through the season, potentially, like that's when the manure composts can be really helpful. But yeah, I don't actually know about the your specific flower question.
We can definitely look it up and get back to you and find some good resources for composting with flowers.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Super helpful.
It's 101, so if you have to hop off, please do your thing. If you have more questions, let me know. I'll hang out for a few more minutes. Alice, thanks so much for being here. This was super interesting.
Thank you everyone for the questions and the discussion. That was great.
Yeah, this was really great. Let me stop the recording. So also you